Hello everybody, good morning, or depending on where you are, good afternoon or good evening. And I think for some of you, and I know for some of our panelists in the session we're about to have, it's a very early good morning to you as well, for those of you who might be watching from the West Coast too. But wherever you are and whatever time it is with you, welcome. And it's great to see you back here for the fourth day of the 9th Annual America's Spectrum Management Conference. So we've had 3 fantastic days so far, and we've had some really interesting discussions taking place on a number of different varied issues. We've been looking at things such as 5G, connectivity in COVID, rural connectivity, spectrum efficiency, spectrum sharing, and much more. So a wide range of the different topical spectrum issues for the region. But now for the last 2 days of the conference, we're actually going to be narrowing the focus slightly. So we're going to be concentrating specifically over the next few sessions on a frequency range that has been described by some as the major spectrum battleground, I suppose, in recent years, and that's the mid-band. So there really is a huge amount going on in a number of key mid-band frequencies, and over the course of the next 2 days, we're going to be looking in detail at some of these. I'm going to bring the program up for today, first of all. So you can see that today, the focus for our 2 plenary sessions is going to be on the 6 gigahertz band and the CBRS band. And those are the two kind of key bands that we're looking at today. Later on today at 12:10, you can see we've also got our 3 showcase sessions running. So for those of you who haven't maybe been to the showcase session yet, they're really interesting sessions. So they're an opportunity to look in more depth at some of the key issues that we're looking at, as I said, in a bit more depth really, and really focus down into some of those issues. They're all hosted by one of our event partners. So the 3 showcases we have running today are on Showcase Stage 1. We have a session that's going to be looking at spectrum sharing and the race to 5G, hosted by TIA. Showcase Stage 2, we have a session looking at bringing spectrum sharing to the 6 gigahertz band, hosted by Federated Wireless. And Showcase Stage 3, we have a session looking at the impact of 5G on consumers, businesses, and the nation, hosted by Ericsson. So those are all to come up later on in the proceedings today. So as I said, though, we are going to be kicking off by looking at the mid-band ranges, and we're going to be focusing specifically on some of those bands in our sessions as we move forward today. But to start everything off, we're going to be having a presentation that's going to be looking more broadly at the 5G spectrum pipeline, both in the mid-band and beyond that as well. And to tell us a little bit more about this, and also to introduce our speaker for the presentation, I'd now like to welcome to the stage our moderator for the first sessions. That's Mark Eschenberg from Ether. So hi, Mark, and welcome.
Hi, Dan. Good to see you again.
Good to see you as well. Good to see you as well. Yeah, and I know that you're going to be moderating both the presentation and the first panel discussion. So we're really looking forward to it. And without further ado, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And good morning, afternoon, or evening to all of you as well who are listening today. As I said, it's a pleasure to be here again. My name is Mark Eschenberg. I'm a partner at Ether Consulting. And to be honest, I don't want to take much of the stage because we have a packed program and a set of exquisite speakers today. The first speaker will be Tom Power, who's an SVP and General Counsel at CTIA. Tom, good morning to you.
Morning. How are you, Mark?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
Great, thanks.
Excellent. Tom, you'll be speaking about the 5G spectrum pipeline, as Dan's already mentioned. I'm intrigued to hear about this. I see the US. I always felt that the US was a bit behind in the mid-band range the last few years, but clearly led the way on millimeter wave. So I'm quite intrigued to hear what you have to kind of tell us about this. So the word's over to you, and we're all ears. Just a quick reminder to the audience before actually we go into the presentation that, as always, you have the chat, and of course we encourage you to be as active as possible. And at the end of Tom's presentation, there will be about 5 minutes for us to discuss. So if you have any things you'd like to ask Tom, this is the opportunity. So,
great, thank you, Mark, and thanks. Hello, everybody. Great to be with you from the nation's capital. I can't believe it's been a year, more than a year, since our last America's Spectrum Management Conference. Here in Washington a year ago, we were all very excited because our team, the Washington Nationals, were on their way to win a World Series. This year, the Nats didn't do so great, but there's still a lot of excitement in Washington and across the nation, and it's all about spectrum. Well, there's some other things in the news too, but today it's about spectrum, and we're going to talk about 5G and mid-band. It's been quite a challenging year for all of us, but when it comes to 5G, it's been a very good year for the U.S. So I thought we'd start by taking a little snapshot of where we are, and starting with some international comparisons, particularly with respect to China. Now, I know these international comparisons are never perfect, but I think they're certainly useful, and they're at least inevitable at a conference like this. So let's take a look, go to the next slide, talk a little bit about where we are on 5G. We know that the U.S. started out with an early start. The first U.S. 5G deployments were 13 months ahead of China. As of this week, big news, the U.S. is now by far the largest country with 3 nationwide 5G networks. The next largest country with 3 nationwide networks is South Korea. We congratulate them, but you know, the U.S. is almost 100 times bigger than South Korea. So it's a real accomplishment here in the U.S. And our 5G deployment is not just in the big cities. From Maine to Mississippi, from Iowa to Alaska, 5G reaches over 75% of the population. China is at about 42%. And the predictions are that by 2025, 74% of U.S. wireless connections will be by 5G. In China, the prediction is closer to 64%. And in the coming months and years, this cycle of innovation and investment and deployment will just continue to build on itself here in the U.S., creating millions of jobs, hundreds of billions in economic productivity, and bringing innovation to every industry vertical. So what accounts for this? Well, we think it's a kind of a simple formula. It's private sector investment, spurred by competition, and built on smart wireless policy. When it comes to capital expenditures, the wireless carriers are always at the top year after year in the U.S. Over $100 billion in just the last few years. The U.S. is about 18% of the world's mobile, about 5% of the world's population, but 18% of the world's mobile CapEx. And in 2019 alone, the U.S. invested 3 times more per capita than China in wireless networks. To some extent, we had an advantage coming into 5G because we led the world in 4G, because even there we saw the potential and we pursued it with smart policy and good investments. So let's go to the next slide and just look back at the history of 4G and the rollout there. From 2010 to today, we've seen wireless users enjoy a 31 times increase in download speeds, a consumption way up, 100 times increase in consumption of data, and huge advances in spectrum efficiency. If you look at the amount of data consumed by Americans, put that in the numerator, and then put the amount of spectrum allocated for mobile broadband in the denominator, that ratio, sort of megabits to megahertz, has increased by a factor of 42 since 2010. That's another way of saying that wireless carriers have become 42 times more efficient in their use of spectrum since 2010. And prices have gone down. The overall consumer price index went up 17% between 2010 and 2019. The wireless price index fell by 24%. And then, of course, logically on top of all this is the contribution to GDP. About $250 billion contributed to GDP by the wireless industry from 2010 to 2020. And of course, what comes with that is job growth, millions of jobs enabled by wireless. One estimate says that for every 10 megahertz of low band spectrum that is auctioned, over 500,000 jobs are created. And if you wanted any more validation about the U.S. getting it right, if we go to the next slide, let's talk about COVID and what happened in the immediate aftermath of COVID. So many countries saw a drop in download speeds as usage patterns moved. In the U.S., speeds actually continued an upward trajectory. And that really is a testament to how the networks have been built, the policies that have gone behind that, and kudos to the FCC who helped expedite some wireless transactions in the immediate aftermath of COVID to help build the robustness of those networks. But again, none of this happens by happenstance. It resulted from a particular policy framework which favored spectrum clearing, exclusive use spectrum license, flexible use rights, private sector investment and competition, and auctions. And you can move off that slide. I want to just spend a second about auctions. What a week for auctions. We won the Nobel Prize. Well, we didn't win the Nobel Prize, but Paul Milgram and Robert Wilson won the Nobel Prize, and they won it in large measure for their work on spectrum auctions. So congratulations to them, building on the work of Professor Coase from 60 years ago, who articulated the vision of spectrum auctions. He was laughed at the time, but he's been vindicated a million times over since then, actually 100 billion times over, representing over $100 billion in revenues that spectrum auctions have generated for the US Treasury since their inception. And the thing about auctions and competition, they are agnostic when it comes to the product involved. And in our world, they are agnostic to the spectrum band. The FCC, as Mark said, was ahead of the world in auctioning high band spectrum for 5G. And because of those auctions, it's a US carrier that's been recognized as having the fastest peak download speeds. Other carriers began their 5G deployments in low band spectrum acquired in earlier auctions. And that's why 5G is deployed so widely. But as you all know, and as Mark referenced, the sweet spot for 5G is mid-band spectrum. It combines a lot of the characteristics of high band with low latency and higher speeds and capacity, but the characteristics of low band too, with greater geographic coverage. And as Mark said, we are in the US playing a little catch up here, but we've got the pedal to the metal. The FCC has been moving aggressively to fill that gap, and the wireless industry and other stakeholders are responding in kind. We began the year with 0 megahertz of licensed mid-band spectrum. Hard to believe. But we've been moving fast. We had the CBRS auction, which closed a couple months ago, 70 megahertz of prime spectrum for license use, a good down payment. It is subject to that sort of novel 3-tiered sharing regime, one aspect of which is lower power limits for commercial providers. That's something of a challenge, but we've had a successful auction, and we're looking forward to the licensed deployments in the CBRS spectrum to complement the unlicensed deployments that have been going on for some time. Of course, now the big news and what we're all anticipating is the C-band auction, ultimately freeing up 280 megahertz of prime mid-band spectrum beginning at 3.7 gigahertz. It's a huge and critical advance when it comes to building on US leadership in 5G. The C-band with the CBRS auction, that means the FCC will have brought 350 megahertz of mid-band spectrum to auction in a very short period of time. And of course, this will complement the low and high band spectrum that are also key to 5G leadership. Now, with the C-band, there were a lot of details to figure out. Things could have been decided differently with respect to auction methodology and the acceleration payments and so forth. But we're getting past those disputes. And with the details largely nailed down, all of the stakeholders are investing and doing the hard work to bring that spectrum to market in a timely fashion. Carriers are assessing their spectrum needs, putting the financing together for auction bids, transition costs, acceleration payments, the down payments, upfront payments are due in a couple of weeks. Satellite operators, the same thing. They are busy building and constructing new satellites. They are contracting with vendors on the ground for the ground-based components like filters and compression equipment and antennas, and working with the earth station operators to ensure a smooth transition. It's an extraordinary amount of work going on to address all the complexities of this auction, and all the stakeholders are hard at work, especially at the FCC. I mentioned Professor Milgram and his Nobel Prize earlier. He's been advising the FCC for years, but it's the FCC team itself that does the implementation. So just a moment to call out a few names there of the folks who are working hard. Of course, Julia McHenry and Don Stockdale and all of their teams, Jonathan Campbell, the chief of the auctions division, Matt Pearl, Mr. Spectrum at the FCC, and Evan Correll, who I think deserved his own Nobel Prize. I want to give them a big shout out. They're probably not watching because they're working on the auction, but next time you see them, tell them thanks. They're doing great work. So C-band plus CBRS, that gives us 350 megahertz, which is great, closing the gap vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Go to the next slide, though, and we'll see that other countries are not sitting still. That number on the right, 660 megahertz, that's the average of mid-band of 5 of our international competitors: China, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and the UK. The US at 350 megahertz after the C-band auction. That leaves us still a gap there with those other countries. Although I guess I should say this slide is perhaps already out of date with the DoD announcement that it's prepared to release another 100 megahertz at 3450 to 3550. And the FCC has launched a proceeding to auction that band by the end of 2021, which will be another vital step to build up the mid-band inventory here in the US. And that band at full commercial power and deployed likely in 2022. So that is a great step forward. Really amazing how fast the US government moved on this band. And kudos here to Eric Berger and the team at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Of course, Fred Moorfield, the Rock over at the Defense Department, and the team at the FCC. Really a great testament to what can happen when we all pull together. And it's interesting to look at the auction framework because it actually has proven to bring spectrum into use faster often than spectrum sharing. If we go to the next slide, you can see where the sharing framework imposed on the CBRS band took about 10 years from the time NTIA identified that spectrum for sharing and the 2020 auction. In contrast, you can see how much faster things moved with the AWS one auction, the 600 megahertz incentive auction, about 3 years for the C-band, and again, the 100 megahertz at 3.45 to 3.55, moving very quickly. So we're very excited for all that's coming in terms of auctions in the mid-band. You can move off that slide now. But to be sure, spectrum policy needs to be an all of the above approach. We're not a one-trick pony when it comes to this. Unlicensed spectrum is vital to the health of the wireless ecosystem. The next panel is going to look at the 6 gigahertz band, where the FCC earlier this year freed up 1,200 megahertz of spectrum for unlicensed, huge amount of spectrum. CTIA had advocated for a more balanced approach, just as other nations are allocating more mid-band for exclusive license use. But we think we can look for some good things coming out of that nonetheless. CBRS, I talked about another non-traditional approach. Took some time. It's got the lower commercial power limits. But again, the biggest bidder was a wireless carrier. And then the Defense Department, it can also be a source of innovation, and wireless carriers have over the years helped support R&D and trials and deployments as necessary to support DoD's mission. Just last week, the Defense Department announced $600 million in awards to conduct various 5G trials at select military bases, which will include significant participation by a major wireless carrier. But this brings me to another development at the Pentagon, and that was the release of an RFI, a request for information, a couple weeks ago that looked at the spectrum at 3100 to 3450, just below the 100 megahertz of spectrum that the FCC plans to auction late next year. That RFI has gotten a fair amount of attention here in the States, and certainly a big chunk of that could be allocated to mobile broadband. That would really help close that gap vis-a-vis our international competitors. So let's take a look a little more closely at that. We have to acknowledge it's a challenging band. In July, NTIA put out a report looking at the challenges there, and that will occur regardless of which method we use to try to free it up. They've called for more analysis, including looking at the potential for relocating incumbents from that band to other portions of the band. One factor there to consider that NTIA pointed out is that there are both classified and unclassified systems in the band. The presence of the classified systems could suggest that relocation is the better option, as opposed to trying to share around systems that the government is maintaining on a classified basis. So there's work to be done to look at that. On the other hand, there could be systems up in that top 100 at 3450 to 3550 that would be moved down or truncated down, compressing into that lower band. So there are some challenges there. But, you know, it's that old Army slogan, the difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little longer. So to the extent the RFI represents DoD's intent to roll up its sleeves and work with industry to see how some of that spectrum can be made commercially available, that's great. We've done that before to great success. I had the privilege of being in the government in the run-up to the AWS-3 auction and working with DoD on that band and freeing up that band, relocating some systems, setting up coordination zones around the systems that had to stay behind in geographic pockets, and then handing the spectrum over to the FCC to make the commercial allocation decisions, run the auctions, and award the commercial licenses to network operators. So this is a sort of backdrop as to why some of the questions in the DoD RFI struck some of us as a little odd. The RFI asked whether DoD could operate a 5G network in that band. It's not clear exactly what they were thinking, but just to step back and remember how things are managed here in the U.S., NTIA manages spectrum for the benefit of U.S. government agencies by making spectrum assignments to those agencies based on their missions to serve the U.S. public. The FCC manages spectrum on behalf of all other spectrum users in the U.S., and most importantly, by managing the allocation of spectrum for commercial use, where as I've said, auctions have become the gold standard. So when DoD asks about whether it could operate a 5G network, the overriding principle to keep in mind is that DoD's use of spectrum, with or without 5G, is limited to fulfilling its military missions, as provided in its assignment by NTIA. DoD does not have a commercial mission, of course, and DoD spectrum cannot be used by anyone for commercial purposes. That's the FCC's role. Neither NTIA nor DoD has the legal authority to make that happen. So just to be clear, the idea of DoD managing spectrum for commercial purposes is a non-starter under the law. The idea of DoD leasing spectrum for commercial purposes is a non-starter under the law. And just the prospect of DoD and building and managing a 5G network for commercial use would set us back years. If you can read a lot about this throughout the trade press, I would suggest a piece that Peter Wasabi published this week in Fierce Wireless, talking about just the practical and technical limitations to what seems to be potentially behind the RFI. DoD doesn't build or operate cellular networks. It's just not part of their mission. B, there are no standards for the type of sharing that DoD is or may be envisioning here. It would take a decade to solve those challenges. And if you want to take full advantage of the full potential of 5G, carriers need to have exclusive access to their share of the spectrum, such as the ability to deploy dynamic spectrum sharing, to operate 5G and 4G LTE simultaneously in the same band. Same with advances like mobile edge computing, bringing processing power to the edge and reducing latency, among other benefits. A carrier really needs its own network. So there was great concern that the RFI was suggesting a use of this spectrum that really wouldn't even be 5G. It certainly wouldn't take advantage of 5G. Nationalizing spectrum does not make sense for anyone. And do you want DoD to be your wireless carrier? I mean, think about it. When you sign a 2-year contract with DoD, it means you're going to boot camp. That's no way to treat a customer. I like to throw a few jokes in to see who's paying attention, but I can't tell because I can't see you. I'm hearing laughter. I'm going to go with it. In any event, I was very glad to see the comments of my friend Fred Moorfield at the CIO's office, the deputy CIO at DoD this week, indicating that the RFI is about solving DoD's own needs, not getting into the business of commercial spectrum allocation. Other countries seek to rely on nationalization. It never turns out well. The U.S. has always succeeded by allowing private sector innovation and investment to flourish. And that's why this RFI has attracted bipartisan opposition throughout government. We all know that spectrum is critical to the Pentagon's defense of the nation. And while the commercial sector sometimes gets into a tug of war with the DoD when it comes to particular spectrum bands, we certainly stand with DoD in seeking to ensure that its vital systems are protected and in looking for win-win strategies to ensure the defense of a nation that sees the value of private sector innovation, investment, and competition to fulfill the needs and interests of the American public. So thanks for listening. Mark, I will send it back to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Tom. I can confirm you had me chuckling for a second there. So
I got one.
But I'm German, so my English colleagues always make fun about my humor. So I'm not sure it's a high bar. Tom, thanks very much for the for those comments. I thought it was fascinating, and you made it hard for me because whenever I had a question, you kind of answered a question about 2 minutes later. But one thing that one question at least that I had when I heard what you were saying is that we these kind of conferences about spectrum management are kind of done across the world, and some people have started challenging auctions as a way to award spectrum. But what I took from your comments, and in particular, of course, with the notes on the Nobel Prize just a few days ago, sounds like you're still very much in favor of auctions as a mechanism to award spectrum in an efficient and suitable manner.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's sometimes some confusion between auctions as a way to allocate commercial spectrum, and then the challenge is to come along with having a crowded use of the entire spectrum. There are lots of technical challenges there, but once you figure out what the commercial rates are, auctions have just proven themselves time and time again to be the right way to go. So, we can, as I said, with AWS-3, right? We had a very successful auction, the biggest auction ever, $40 billion in revenues. There was some sharing involved. We had to carve out some exclusion or coordination zones so that DoD could run some systems in some various areas. So there was some sharing involved. But once you have to figure out who gets the spectrum, auctions have just proven themselves to be the way to go.
Perfect. I'm conscious of time, but there's one other question from the audience which I would like to ask as well. Is that you kind of had this comparison of a mid-band spectrum gap between the US and some other countries, and the question was just how you came to those 600 and something megahertz for the other countries, which bands were included in there.
The quick answer is, if you go to the CTIA website, we've got a whole report on it, making those international comparisons with those countries and others.
Perfect. In which case, we've already directed traffic to the CTIA as well, which is great news. Brilliant. Tom, great start to the day. Thanks very much for taking the time to talk us through all this. It's been a pleasure hearing from you. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody.
In which case, it's now my pleasure to introduce the first panel session of the day, a session which is all about the 6 gigahertz band, a band which the US clearly is again pushing things along at a pace that's maybe ahead of some other countries. As many of you will know, kind of early this year there was a decision by the FCC to open up the band to unlicensed use. That has not completely gone without legal objections, which is clearly something that we will kind of discuss as part of the panel. But the band is clearly seen as very important for connectivity, and so I'm very, very pleased to have a very wide-ranging panel today to discuss these points. We have people from the mobile industry, we have people from various other users. So I really hope it's going to be a lively panel with plenty of discussion afterwards. So I don't want to take any more time, but I'll introduce the speakers. I'll introduce them one after the other rather than kind of going with all names immediately. Each speaker will have about 5 to 7 minutes to give some introductory remarks. If you have questions, please keep posting them, and then we'll pick them up at the end once all panel members have made their contribution, and then we'll go into a wider discussion. So with that in mind, the first panelist we have today is Veena Rawat. She's a senior spectrum advisor at GSMA. Veena, good morning. Pleasure to have you here.
Good morning.
And without any further ado, I'll hand over to you. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Forum Global to invite me. And I'm really glad to be here to talk about it. So can I see my first slide, please? So let's move on. So we talk about 6 gigahertz, and obviously we want to know why the 6 gigahertz is needed. And this slide just basically shows you that by 2025, 20% of the total connections will be 5G. So 5G will need spectrum, and we need to plan not only about the 5G spectrum, both for what is needed now and for its evolution. The other thing this slide shows you is what is the impact, the socioeconomic impact of 5G, and it's the studies we have done. It's about 16 million jobs, direct employment, and then it's also supported by additional 14 million of indirect jobs. And on the right-hand side, you see the growth in GDP by 2024 of 4.9%. So it's significant economic impact of 5G, and that's why we would need the spectrum not only for what folks are implementing now, but also for evolution. Next slide, please. So here's the 5G evolution. How do we get the spectrum? We go to ITU, we go to the WRCs, and the next WRC 23 has the opportunity to actually fill the gap. First of all, this gap for mid-band spectrum for 5G. This gap has been there since we started to talk about the mid-band for 5G in 2000, 4G or 5G at that point in 2007. And that gap is continuing. We were not able to fill it at WRC 15. WRC 23 is a unique opportunity to address the mid-band capacity for 5G for longer term. Why is the mid-band needed? The mid-band is needed, as we know, we have been hearing throughout this conference also. The low band, the mid-band, and the high band. We need the mid-band because it's ideal to provide both the capacity and the coverage. The other thing the WRCs do, which is extremely important, and that is if we really want to address the digital divide and make sure that that digital divide is not increased because of 5G, the folks living in rural areas do get the same high-speed broadband as we do, and not living in, the folks are not living in rural areas. Then harmonization of the spectrum, the global, or if the global is not, the global is ideal, or regional harmonization is extremely important to get the economies of scale. So that's what are the possible actions we can have, we can expect at WRC 23 for the mid-band spectrum. Next slide, please. So what does the WRC 23 spectrum agenda looks like for 5G? I mentioned you need low band, and they will address the low band, in particular the 600 meg. It's not globally harmonized, and we are very glad to see that WRC 23 will address low band. But here we are talking about the mid band. Yes, the mid band, as I mentioned, the C band, we started the discussion from 3.3 to 3.8. We started the discussion in 2007, the WRC 2007. That gives you the idea how long some of these decisions take to actually reach the global harmonization. This conference has on the agenda the range 3.3 to 3.8 gigahertz. And you heard from Tom Powers, all the activity which is going on around in this band. This is the band right now, which folks are making, the regulators are making available for 5G. But then the other two bands are 4800 to 4990 megahertz, which is a NATO band and not necessarily available everywhere. And then the last but not the least band, what we are talking about is what I refer to as upper 6 gigahertz, is the 6425 to 7125 gigahertz. And then we did identify a good chunk of spectrum, what was needed for 5G in the millimeter waves for the high capacity bands. But this conference will also address, at least for the Americas region, another 500 megs in the 10 gigahertz range. Next slide. So what is the 6 gig? The whole 6 gig, as Tom mentioned, the FCC in the US identified the whole 1200 megahertz, which starts at 5925 megahertz and goes up to 7125. That's what this chart shows you. So US identified it for unlicensed completely. But there are administrations also looking at its need completely or upper part of the band for licensed spectrum, not just unlicensed. And that's what Tom also mentioned, that we need a balanced approach here. So China is looking at the entire range for licensed, and then Europe is looking at the lower part of the spectrum for unlicensed, and upper part of the spectrum as part of the WRC 23. We are looking at for the licensed spectrum. And the reason I have two different colors here is that most of the spectrum is for WRC 23 consideration is for region 1, which is Europe, Middle East, Arab, and the Russian countries. But the top 100 megahertz is also to be considered globally. And we are hoping that we would have good discussion at WRC 23, and we'll keep in mind this balanced approach. Next slide. So at GSMA, we obviously worked with the manufacturers and operators, and we did a questionnaire, and 90% of mobile operators and 100% of all the equipment manufacturers, 100%, they said the 6425 to 7125 megahertz is a high priority for the future IMT. Yes, C-band will provide some capacity, but let's not forget, for getting those tens of gigabits of rates, broadband speeds, C-band only has, you look from the Tom's charts, from somewhere between 310 to 500-600 megahertz, depending on, in some countries, which country and what timing you're talking about. The figure of this 90% of the mobile operators and the 100% of the manufacturers clearly indicated, based on their needs, that this figure comes from all the three regions. So this is a figure based on global. Last slide, please. So what is the future of 6 gigahertz, at least from mobile operators' perspective, for licensed 5G perspective? We recognize it's considered for unlicensed use in several countries, but we also have to recognize that this 6G is the lowest band, which is a great band for backhaul. And we need to make sure that the backhaul is protected. We also see from my previous slide, and I'm sure you will hear a lot more on this panel, that the plans for the 6 gigahertz, for the upper 6 gigahertz, they differ from country to country. The part of the WRC 23 agenda, it is there, and it will be discussed for IMT. And we want to make sure that this top part, the 700 meg, is protected for possible IMT use. The reason I say that is WRC 23 can make a decision for IMT, but the WRCs only provide you enabling provisions. They do not decide for a national country. It would be up to the national regulators. They will decide what they want to use the spectrum for. However, if we miss the WRC 23 opportunity, you will have to, and the 5G needs this spectrum, mid-band spectrum, the upper 6 gigahertz. If you miss that opportunity at WRC 23, you have to wait at least minimum 4 years, but that's not the case. Most of the time, you will need 8 years or more to get another WRC decision for IMT identification, which is an enabling provision. It provides flexibility to the national regulators. So I think we have to keep that in mind, that WRCs can only do, they are the only place where we can get global harmonization. And we don't want to push the mid-band spectrum where the discussion started in 2007. We don't want to push it to WRC 2027 or beyond. That's not how the technology is moving for 5G. That's not how the 5G services are going to be delivered. So let's hope that we will have a balanced approach at WRC 23. Thank you very much.
Nina, thanks very much for this introductory remarks. I think you made a very clear case of the importance of licensed spectrum. Next speaker is, and I'm sure we'll pick up the discussion of licensed versus unlicensed much more in the panel discussion, of course. The next speaker is Megan Stull. Megan is a counsel at Google. Hi, Megan.
Hi. Thanks for having me on this beautiful morning here in Washington, D.C. With other companies that are represented on this panel, Google was part of a coalition of chipset makers, equipment manufacturers, and innovators who urged the FCC to open the full 1200 megahertz of the 6 gigahertz band to unlicensed use. Now, rather than have all those members of the coalition give you the same sort of presentation here, we've decided to cover different angles in our introductory remarks. So I'll be providing a summary of the FCC's order and its status. Next slide, please. I want to kind of lay the stage here on why Google would care about this. First of all, let me say that we are proponents of spectrum being made available, shared, and used. And that goes for licensed and unlicensed spectrum frequencies. And when we're looking at the 6 gigahertz decision, as Tom mentioned in his remarks earlier, we can't take the stance that the FCC just forgot about the licensed community. To the contrary, when you take a step back and look at all of the contemporaneous spectrum activities occurring at the FCC, you see a very significant decision the month before the 6 gigahertz order was released. And that was the C-band order that covered 3.7 to 4.2. And that was a boon for our licensed friends. And then in April, you see the FCC proceeding with the 6 gigahertz order that had the benefits for unlicensed spectrum, which, as we know, and many of us are experiencing right now in this pandemic setting, also has benefits for licensed as well, with offload occurring on unlicensed frequencies. As shown on this slide, 6 gigahertz provides a really big opportunity for unlicensed technologies. It's sort of a blockbuster, right? It's an epic release of 1200 megahertz of spectrum. That's about 2 decades in the making. It has nice big channels, 160 megahertz or up to 320 megahertz wide. It's part of this bigger 5G story that the FCC is working on. It brings significant economic benefits. The FCC cited a study noting that there would be $150 billion infused into the economy from this decision alone. It supports technologies that we are all relying on right now, like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, and particularly Wi-Fi 6. And for Google, it also has that, in addition to what I just mentioned, the exciting and intriguing angle of automated frequency coordination, which is akin to, but simpler to execute than the SAS model and the 3.5 CBRS band. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to look at what the FCC did in its order in 2 buckets. And this is bucket 1, which is standard power access points and clients. Now, these are restricted to UNI 5 and 7. It's 850 megahertz total. Can operate at up to 36 dBm. You have incumbents in the band as well, fixed point-to-point systems. And this is the automated frequency coordinator concept. So basically, if you want to use this spectrum, you register with the AFC, and the AFC will generate a list of channels and powers. You could proceed to use that, and then you'll be checking in daily, at least daily, with the AFC to make sure that circumstances haven't changed. Now, next slide hits the second bucket of what the FCC covered in this order, which is low power indoor access points and clients with the magic power of 5 dBm megahertz. Now, unlike our AFC, here we're talking UNI 5, 6, 7, 8. Again, there are incumbents in this spectrum, mobile and satellite systems, and you're not permitted to cause harmful interference to those systems. And you notice that keyword indoor. The FCC did, in its order, create rules to try to make sure that these devices stay indoor. So no weatherizing them, internal antennas, no battery power, and they need to be, I say plugged into a wall, but hooked up to a power source is really a more sophisticated way, I guess, of saying it. Our next slide covers some common rules of the road for both of these buckets. I already mentioned the channel size. There are limits on mobility, with an exception for LPI in UNI 5 in large aircraft over 10,000 feet. Lots of conditions there. You have some ability to have access points communicate with one another to join a network. And there's a requirement for use of a contention-based protocol. Next slide. Not everybody is excited about the FCC's order. We're going to be hearing about some of those controversies on this panel. But one thing to not lose sight of when legal challenges are pending is that this order has been in effect since July, and the FCC is indeed proceeding to allow devices into this spectrum. The FCC lab had out a KDB seeking feedback on procedures for authorizing LPI devices. Now, the AFC is going to come later. There's some more groundwork that needs to be laid there. So while these legal challenges are ongoing, the FCC is moving forward. In the DC circuit, appeals have been filed by public safety entities, utilities, and telcos. But plenty of folks are intervening on the FCC's behalf, including NCTA, the sort of RLAN and innovator community that I described, the Wi-Fi community. And what's the status there? APCO and EEI filed motions for stay and to expedite the proceedings, and those were denied by the court. And we're waiting on a briefing schedule. The FCC also has an internal appeals process that's called petitions for reconsideration, and several of those are pending, seeking recon on various aspects of the 6 gigahertz order. They were filed by CTIA, Verizon, and FWCC. There was one also filed by Encina, but that came in late and was dismissed. And one filed by APCO that was withdrawn. Presumably they're spending their energies in that court setting. Finally, next slide. I'd be remiss to not talk about the FCC's current and diligent work on its further notice of proposed rulemaking. Several items in play there that the FCC is considering right now. Higher power limits for LPI devices, very low power operations, both indoors and out, and mobility, as we mentioned, for standard power APs, higher power under that AFC scenario, and allowing AFCs to take antenna directivity into account. That's all for me from right now. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Brilliant, Megan. Thanks very much for this introduction. I think it was very, very clear and made a lot of sense. The next speaker is Alan Norman, who's a director of public policy at Facebook. And I am waiting for excellent. And here is Alan. Hello.
Hi, Mark. Thank you. And thank you, everyone. I'm Alan Norman, Public Policy Director at Facebook, and I work in our Connectivity Policy Group, focusing a lot of my energy on spectrum policy around the world. I'm going to talk some more about the technical aspects of the 6 gigahertz band. So next slide, please. The first thing I'd like to talk about are some of the incumbent services here and why this helped inform the FCC's decision. There are lots of different uses. There are fixed links operated by utilities, by telcos, public safety, and broadcast services. There is fixed satellite service uplink. There's also a few downlink sites. And then there are things like electronic news gathering. These are all important incumbents. And one of the things that the FCC looked at when they made their decision was the trade-off of the costs and time to clear the band, the impact on the incumbents, versus the ability to deploy more quickly and bring economic value. And in this case, what the FCC identified was that low power products and services based on Wi-Fi and other unlicensed technologies was something they could move quickly and provide significant economic benefit. And what I've done here is shown the band plan. And if you can go to the next slide, as Megan outlined, there are really 4 different kinds of devices and technologies that are allowed. One is standard power access points, which are under the control of the database. And this is 36 dBm was the maximum power that was considered safe at this point. Low power access points, the very low power, which is still under an FMPRM. And the thing that I wanted to add that Megan hadn't mentioned was the client devices, which operate at 60 dB below the access points for fixed indoor. And there's also a category called subordinate. So what this does is enable a broad range of use cases. Next slide. That take advantage of the Wi-Fi channel plan. And if you look at this, what's important is people say, well, why do you need so much spectrum? Well, what's happening here is in 2.5 or 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, there are not any current 160 megahertz channels available. There are no 320s. And so in addition to, the expectations and growth and capacity needs, there's also an innovation opportunity here where you can enable very new use cases and significantly better performance and new types of applications. And that's really significant. It's part of what's the charm and the value of unlicensed spectrum is you really get an opportunity to create new things that no one expects or anticipates. And what the FCC has done is created that opportunity in spades in this case. Next slide, please. So one is indoor. All of a sudden, we can now reach the whole home at gigabit speeds. And this is very important. So we expect that cable enterprise will rapidly deploy 6 gigahertz because you can now basically really amplify what Wi-Fi can offer and do and provide that last hop connection to augment either the your wireline network or even in many cases your wireless network that you're connected to. And this This, we think, will be the very, very edge of how people connect. Next slide. Similarly, with very low power, which is being considered, there are now applications like augmented reality and virtual reality, connecting your headset, ultra high density video streaming, tethering off your phone, and in vehicle. And the key here is the ability to lower latencies to below 3 milliseconds to operate at brain speed. So it's not just going to be a small box on your screen, but very rich video, very rich 3D presentations that people will see. And not just one-way streaming, but interactive that'll be enabled here. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a summary of how low power indoor is deployed, how standard power indoor might work, and very low power. And the one thing I want to point out about very low power is we think it's actually a significant complement to 5G. In the same way that low power indoor and standard power will offer additional coverage and capacity to complement your 5G network when you're indoor or places where there aren't coverage or there are capacity limitations. When you're out and about, we expect that wearable devices tethered to a 5G device will provide that last hop of experience to enable you to do things in a power efficient way and connect all sorts of new devices and experiences that no one's imagined or are really seen before, but just get hints at with things like your watch, smart glasses that may be coming along, and other different kinds of devices. Next slide, please. So the second thing, and I'm going to shift gears here a little bit, is when the FCC made their decision to make 5925 to 7125 unlicensed back in April, a shot was fired around the world. And what happened is there was very rapid movement across multiple governments, administrations to look at this same band. And so very quickly, you see what happened was the UK made a decision in July to open up the bottom part of the band. Europe is also moving well along on that same process. We project sometime late this year, early next year, that decision will be finalized. And I would point out that through the ITU process, it was not Europe, but rather Africa that drove the decision to support an IMT study for the upper part of the band. Europe's considerations, if people look at it closely, were really more about what to do with incumbents and how to move forward and understanding how the sharing regime could work. But Europe and UK were not the only markets. Next slide, please. Korea also decided to move forward. And so they've put out an administrative order, which we expect will come into effect shortly, where the whole 5925 to 7125 will be made available for low power indoor, and the bottom part of the band unlicensed for very low power access points, with further studies on how to do sharing between the broadcast services and the outdoor very low power, how to increase low power indoor, and move forward with the database for Korea frequency control. And if you go to the next slide, here I've put together a timeline that shows a very large number of countries that have already either issued RFIs or expressed public interest. And so this includes Brazil, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, UAE, and then of course, here in Region 1, we have Canada, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru as well, in addition to Brazil. So as you might imagine, many of the folks on this panel are extremely busy working with a variety of governments to make sure that the information is provided so that they can make appropriate decisions. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Alan, thanks very much for your presentation. I appreciate that Megan and you kind of coordinated and had a legal explanation and then a bit more into the use case and the international perspectives. Our next speaker is Jane Stankovic, who is a global executive director at Intel. Jane, you're one of the unlucky West Coast people. We very much appreciate you being up that early in the morning.
There's starting to be a little sunlight out there, just a little.
Well, that's better than the UK.
Yes, it was an early morning start or a late night start for me, one of the two. So if I could show the slides, please, and move to the second one. So I want to talk a little bit about the World Radio Conference. As Vina and Alan had mentioned, it is on the agenda in terms of Work 23, Agenda Item 1.2. But I want to make sure that everybody is very clear about what is being studied. So right now, under Agenda Item 1.2, the ITU will conduct studies, so sharing and compatibility studies with incumbent users. But with that, part of the agenda item is also this consideration of the identification for IMT. And if you look at the bands below the bullets there, what you'll see is for Region 2, which is the Americas, on your little chart in the corner, that would be the Americas region, or CTEL. There in Region 2, you have the 3600 to 3800 and the 3300 to 3400 megahertz band, and then the 10 to 10.5 gigahertz band, as well as the 7025 to 7125 megahertz band, which is being considered globally. So for countries in the Americas region, the 6425 to 7025 gigahertz band is not being studied. That is for Region 1 only, and which is Europe, the Middle East, or ASMG in parlance of the ITU preparatory groups, Africa, and the Russian Commonwealth countries, so RCC. So those are the regions that are being studied in terms of 6425 to 7025. So with respect to the three regions, including the Americas, it's just the 7025 to 7125 that's under consideration out of the 6 gigahertz range. We do have a very important spectrum, the 3300 to 3400 and 3600 to 3800 megahertz, and then the 10 to 10.5 gigahertz that are also being studied for Region 2. But I just wanted to make sure everybody was very clear in terms of the upper 6 gigahertz band and what is being studied with respect to Region 2 or the Americas. And if we can move to the next slide, please. So there's not many words here, but I wanted to provide a little perspective because I've been doing this for a long time. So in terms of RLANs, which is ITU speak for radio local area networks, or Wi-Fi, 5G NRU, for example, and unlicensed technologies. The last time there was any consideration with any decisions made by the World Radio Conference was in 2003. That was a long time ago. And I was actually working on Wi-Fi at that point. And I can tell you that it was before, when you still had the PC MIA cards with the external antennas that plugged into a laptop. Wi-Fi was not integrated in any laptops at all at that point. There were no iPhones or other smartphones that were incorporating this technology. And there was a lot of skepticism that Wi-Fi would ever be used. And at that point, as you can see, we had 5, 10, and 20 megahertz channels. So we've gone from a time when the international community last considered Wi-Fi, we've gone from a time when it wasn't being utilized in devices, except for those external cards, and with smaller channels, to a technology that now carries 50% of all internet traffic worldwide. Half of all internet traffic worldwide goes over Wi-Fi networks. And with that, that includes offloading, in-house use, etc. But when you look at that, that is done without refarming or moving any of the incumbent users. So it is clearly and very important to make sure that we're also meeting the demand for unlicensed technologies as well. And as Megan pointed out, during COVID, it's apparent to everybody how crucial the digital highway is, and access to the internet is for all of our citizens around the world. So I want to be clear about one thing. Intel is a leader in both licensed and unlicensed technology. So we are one of the leading providers in terms of 5G infrastructure. and we're one of the leading providers in terms of Wi-Fi and other unlicensed technologies. So we strongly support licensed spectrum, and we strongly support licensed exempt spectrum. And when we look at that, we look at a variety of factors when we're trying to make some of these decisions. So one of it is, as we're seeing this increase in demand in the Wi-Fi side, for example, as I said, in 2003, we had 5, 10, and 20 megahertz channels. Today's technology, Wi-Fi 6, uses 20 up to 160 megahertz channels. And the work that's being done to work on the standardization of Wi-Fi 7 is expecting up to 320 megahertz channels. So those channels are needed for offloading and in-home use and the new applications that are happening throughout the world. And so and every technology does this, you go with wider channels as you go forward to meet the use demands. And so there you do need those wider channels, and that's one of the reasons for the more spectrum being needed. So finally, in terms of the technical considerations that Intel looks at when we're looking at, licensed or unlicensed spectrum, we are a technology company, so we take a very technical approach to it. We look at factors such as the proximity to other types of devices. So for instance, your laptop currently probably has 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi in it. So the antennas and the radios, etc., are set up so that you can actually use those. And so it's very easy to expand that to 6 gigahertz range, just like it's easy for licensed to operate within the 3.3 to 5 gigahertz tuning range. And the other consideration that we take into account is we look at the incumbent use of a band, and we take into account how easy it might be to refarm that spectrum, or what sharing considerations would look like in the band. And so when we did this at Intel, we strongly support licensed spectrum within 3 to 5 gigahertz tuning range, and unlicensed spectrum in the 6 gigahertz 5925 to 7125. So I hope that helps explain some of the rationale behind why some of the decisions were made, or why it might be easier to do licensed in some bands and unlicensed in others. But I'll turn it back to you now, Mark, and look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Brilliant, Ben. Thanks very much for this presentation and kind of explaining your or Intel's perspective on these matters. Our next speaker is Mark Gibson. Mark is a Senior Director of Business Development and Spectrum Policy at CommScope. So I hope he's appearing. Brilliant. Hey, Mark.
Hi, Mark. It's good to have another Mark on the panel.
I usually share a lot of these panels with Mark. It's coming around.
It's worth noting that I'm a member of the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, and there's 5 people in that committee named Mark. So when somebody hollers Mark, there's 5 of us raise our hands. So that's kind of interesting. So thanks. So if you could bring the deck up, I'll get started. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you very much to the Forum Europe for the session, and for my co-panelists. It's been an interesting discussion so far. I'm going to try to cover different information than what folks have said so far, just to kind of fill in some of the gaps. One point I'd like to mention about CommScope, as I was thinking about this, is our interests lie across this whole band in most of the corners of it. You heard Megan mention the coalition that formed to get the band allocated. We were part of that through the Ruckus business unit. We're part of the Wi-Fi Alliance and the Wireless Innovation Forum that are working on the standards for the AFC, and we do a lot of work in the frequency coordination for the incumbents. So it's pretty interesting that we feel it's interesting that we're across the whole band. So could you go to the next slide? So you've heard from a couple of the panelists about the fact that the band is 1200 megahertz, which gives rise to large channels. And so this is great because it gives also rise to lots of basically features and benefits. And while Wi-Fi was a driving factor for this, this is unlicensed. So it's Wi-Fi and all the other unlicensed things. And so when you consider NRU and 3GPP and a lot of the other unlicensed things, and in fact, I think the final panelist is going to deal with some other unlicensed aspects of it, it just opens up tons of opportunity and benefits, that you can see there on the slide. So let's go to the next slide. And also a lot of use cases. I doubt there's any use cases specifically that this will enable that aren't already there, but it'll enable what's there in a big way. One of the things we haven't talked a lot about is fixed wireless access. The 5 gigahertz band, which is right below this band, there's a lot of point-to-point microwave in that band, which is unlicensed. And in fact, I get my internet where I live in Maryland from a wireless internet service provider using a 5 gigahertz unlicensed link to my house. So the 60 gig band will enable more of that across all of these applications. So if you go to the next slide, please. It's probably hard to see this, and Alan talked a little bit about this as well, but what I wanted to focus in on was the image, if you will, which kind of just lays out who are the incumbents. And again, you saw on Alan's deck, he had a good picture of incumbents, and this just sort of is another representation, but also the magnitude of their presence. And so where the standard power devices are going to be is where point-to-point microwave systems are. And you can see from just looking at that there are about 45,000 links, microwave links in the band, and a link is 2 ends and the line in the middle. So that's a lot of microwave. And then when you think about the number of frequencies, it's over 106,000 frequencies, and just in the Uni 5 and Uni 7 bands. And then when we look across the whole spectrum, and so those 2 bands will be for the low power or the standard power operation. When you look across the whole band, when you consider the low power indoor, there are over 106,000 operations. And you know, I think for the most part, we all believe that the rulemaking was clear insofar as that the potential for interference from low power indoor is mitigated by lots of factors. But you know, there's a lot of incumbents there that will need to be dealt with, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So the next slide, please. So the coordination with all of the standard power devices will be managed by something called an automatic frequency coordinating system, or an AFC. And you can see a picture essentially of what I showed earlier in the lower 6 gig band, which is a 5925 to 6425 meg band. So the AFC will need to determine whether an individual standard power access point can operate in a given area on a given frequency. So it'll ask and it'll get an answer back. The AFC will have to determine interference analysis run an interference analysis to determine that to avoid interference not just into incumbent microwave systems but incumbent operations. And you saw from Alan's deck that there were a lot of incumbent operations, most of which are microwave. And the other thing that's associated with this is inherent inaccuracy with the device location. Most of these devices don't have GPS built into them, or if they do, the GPS fixes or have some inaccuracy. So we'll have to deal with that, and actually inserts a complication. So if you go to the next slide, we'll see a little bit about what that looks like in the AFC. So in the Commission's rulemaking, they basically gave some very basic guidance on how the AFC should, well, some basic and some detailed, on how the AFC should operate. And anybody that's familiar with the CBRS proposed, or approach, not proposal, but actual approach, or the TV whitespace approach, this is similar to that. And I won't read everything, but basically devices will contact an AFC. The AFC will run an analysis on that device's request based on where it is and what it's looking for to determine the spectrum availability for where it is and what it's doing. And then we'll send back to the device the available frequencies and available spectrum, and then the device can choose what it wants to do. And then that's it. The device can operate, and then the device has to check back with the AFC once a day. Within the further notice, the Commission is asking about mobility support. We'll talk about that when the time is right, but that will be another thing we'll have to do. And then at the bottom, you see what this notion of location uncertainty means with respect to accuracy. What it drives when you consider the X, Y, and Z axis is something called an oblate spheroid. And so there won't be any tests for this, but that's what you call it. And so we'll have to determine within the calculations how where devices might be on that oblate spheroid as it relates to the interference potential. So it's not perfunctory by any means. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's going on within the industry is the formation of a multi-stakeholder group to work on this. The Commission's rulemaking, they spent a fair amount of ink describing how a multi-stakeholder group should come together, modeled loosely on what's being done in the C-band. And the group was just formed, in fact, on Friday last week. One may wonder why it took so long, and it mostly just because there were administrative issues getting it up and running. But we're up and running. Anybody who has an interest in this is welcome to participate. And we've identified 4 work streams, which are in the next slide. So to go to the next slide, please. So the 4 work streams, and I won't go into great detail on them. One is to the process for determining interference, detecting and resolving interference. Basically, the commission asked the multi-stakeholder group to help it develop approaches on what to do when interference is reported, whether related to or not related to the AFC. So that's what that working stream is going to work on. The second work stream is going to deal with issues on data. The commission said that the data used for this will be exclusively the ULS. And anybody that's worked in the ULS knows that there are issues associated with that just because the ULS is not meant for this sort of application. So we'll be working on that. The third work stream is the development and implementation of the AFC. And the final work stream is work stream 4, which is not what we've agreed within the multi-stakeholder group that we'll have a work stream 4. We're just not sure what we're going to call it yet. So it'll be something related to contention-based protocols. And once the work stream gets, or the multi-stakeholder groups gets established and starts working, they'll fix that. So next slide. Timeline is we're going to start working on this. We've started working on it already, and we expect to get the multi-stakeholder group process definition done by pretty much the end of the year next year, roughly this time. And we're hopeful to have test and certification for AFCs by the end of the year. So that's my deck, and I'll return it back to Mark. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Mark, thanks very much. That was very insightful, understanding a bit more about the AFC in particular and how that will work, or how that's intended to work. And last but not least, we have our final panelist, which is Tim Harrington. Tim is chairman of the board of the Ultra Wideband Alliance. And from what I understand, you're on backup power, Tim, but I hope we'll be fine throughout this presentation.
I checked my fuel level, and I've got plenty of gas to keep the generator running. California has gone through some year, let me tell you. If it isn't fires, then they're shutting off the power because it's too hot. It's just been one thing after another. But wanted to talk a little bit about ultra wideband. And if we could go to the first slide. So one of the interesting things is that it really has been since 2003 that there has been unlicensed use of the 6 gigahertz band. Ultra wideband in 2003 was enabled, and it goes all the way up to 10 gigahertz. But mostly everybody put their systems into 6 gigahertz because the rule set also included wideband, and wideband was a little less restrictive. One of the things that we found interesting is, things move at different rates. Back in '85, when it first became possible to use unlicensed in the 2.4 gig, one of the first things that was done was 2.4 gigahertz, and that was done by a combination of people, both NCR and Symbol, and there was one of those little micro card companies that was also involved, and that was the first one. And as we trace that, it was about 23 years in total before it made it into the phone and really hit volume. As one of the speakers said earlier, initially it was just PCM-CIA cards. They weren't built into anything. So we saw that take off. And so it's a slow ramp that starts and does one of these curves. And we've seen the same thing happen with UWB. With UWB, it was 2003 that was first allowed. 2006 was the first time there was a standard for 802.15 4A. And then it stayed kind of as a niche product. It did important things like automating how you can manufacture a car and know where every single item is, tracking tools and aircraft manufacturing and such. But the real big change really just happened over the past 2 years, and that was 2018. IEEE went back and we started 802.15.4Z, which was increasing the integrity of the locating, because one of the big things that ultra wideband does is it locates better than anything else because it is so wide. Typically, these systems are a full gigahertz wide in the amount of band that they take. which is a little bit different. We've got usage, and what's really changed is that now with the release of the iPhone 11 last year, which was based on this Z standard, which was still going through the standardization process, but Apple jumped on it and made their hardware according to the Phi layer there. And so now, over the past month or two, we've had the release of the iPhone 12, which also uses UWB for locating and for fine granular identification. We've had Xiaomi release their Mi 10 series, and Samsung release the Note 20U, and they've got the G out there now too, which all use UWB. So it's something that is accelerating rapidly from being a niche technology to a high use consumer one. If we go to the next slide. And this change moving into the consumer market and out of these niche markets, I mean, the niche markets even include things like NFL football. Every single game that you watch is tracked 100% of the time by a UWB system. And when you see those replays and they show where the player ran, that's all being done by UWB, and that's at every one of the NFL stadiums. But again, that's not the same volume that we see in consumer. So what we saw with consumer is that things really start to take off as it's integrated into all the mobile phones and finding its way into tablets. Then all of a sudden the numbers change and they go from 1 million or 2 units into tens of millions into hundreds of millions of units. So we see, since they are so accurate in their locating capabilities, one of the things that's unique about it is COVID tracing would be very, very easy to do with UWB, and will be as more and more of the phones have it in it. Because you can be accurate down to a centimeter or two, it's completely different than the guessing game that is forced on narrower band utilizations of the frequency, where you really can't get that kind of accuracy. So we see this growing, and we wanted to bring this up because UWB, like I said, it has been unlicensed all this time since 2003. So the unlicensed newness really is based on a different set of values in terms of the power output and how the band is cut up. Next slide, please. So one of the things, just want to make you aware of some of the things that the use cases for UWB. Like I said, high resolution contact tracing, passive keyless entry, the car keys that everybody's getting in their new cars where they just have a start button, those are easy to spoof. And with UWB, they're very difficult to spoof. And so we see almost all of the manufacturers are moving to UWB for opening their key. Find My Stuff applications, because of the accuracy and the ability with a mobile phone to even tell which direction it's coming from, things like finding your normal key or other things that you want to find become trivial, just becomes part of it. AR and VR, because as you get into the high bands up into the hundreds of gigahertz, it now becomes incredible how accurate it can be, and you can actually drive your AR and VR off of it. And so a lot of the same players that are excited about what they're doing with their new devices are very excited about what they're going to be able to do by including this into healthcare and such. Next slide. So just want to give you a quick on the UWB Alliance. There's 26 member companies, 6 semiconductor companies. We've got consumers, we've got people who have systems. And so this has allowed us, we really are seeing big growth That's 6 semiconductors. If we go back 3 years ago, there was 1, maybe 2, and some of those were startups and such. So we've really seen an explosion here. Next slide. So this is just a quick thing, the things that we do with the Alliance. We work to help shape the UWB rulemaking as it's going to continue to evolve, develop strategies for coexistence, act as a center of excellence for new people as they are getting involved. We're seeing a lot of growth within UWB, and promote interoperability based on 4Z. And next slide, and I think that's be the last one. These are some of the things that we're doing going forward. 6 gigahertz has been very important to us, but we see other things that are exciting for UWB. Increase the freedom of outdoor use, increase the indoor power as we see other users getting into indoor power. We want to have some amount of ability to work equivalently. Extend the 15250 rules up into 8 gigahertz so that we can go ahead and use that. And these are, if you take a look at that, these are the things that we are working and bringing forward for our membership. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Tim. That was a very interesting introduction for me to UWB, and I hadn't fully appreciated, of course, that it's not just always about speed, but just purely also just the sheer amount of information you can transfer that can just change how things work. I'm glad to have all the panelists back. Again, thanks to all of you for your contributions. We have about 20 minutes left for discussion. I'll reiterate my suggestion to the audience. If you have any questions you want to ask these panelists, go ahead and shoot them over to us via the chat. In the meantime, I'll kick off the discussion by looking at the poll results that we had. There were 2 polls on the for the audience to answer. The first one was all about let's say a personal, asking a personal opinion, whether people agree with the FCC's decision, not so much about whether it's going to actually happen or not, but whether people agree. And a bit of a split panel. 39% said yes, they agree with the FCC. 43% said no, and then 17% haven't made up their mind yet. Can I just maybe pass around the torch, so to say, across the panel for some comments on that, and what you feel about the rulemaking, and maybe also from your side. I think, Megan, you made it quite clear it looks like it's going to stay, but whether you have any views on that as well.
Well, looking at the results, I can't say that I find them terribly surprising, given the discussion that we had about the various challenges that are occurring to the FCC's order, whether that be in petitions for reconsideration or in appeals. We have a lot of undecided there, which is quite interesting as well. But I think, the question is also quite broad, right? Making all of the band available for use, and also the question of approach. Because as we see in those petitions for reconsideration, there are various aspects of the commission's decision from the petitioners that are actually supported, even when people are asking for them to reconsider various parts of the order. So I think that this is really reflective of the types of advocacy that the FCC saw in the record. But I would point out as well that the FCC's decision was grounded in, their citation of, I don't even know how many pages of engineering studies that were put in by various proponents. It's a well-supported decision. Probably could, create multiple encyclopedia-sized books filled with all of the studies that were there that the FCC referenced. And, we'll see, what the court says about, whether it would stand the test of time. But given the various constituency and stakeholders here, I can't say that I find the poll to be very surprising in its results.
Thanks, Magna. Anybody else wants to contribute to this question or to comment on the poll result?
Just one quick thing, Mark, if I could, just to add on to Megan. The one thing about the question is, as Megan said, it's sort of in a vacuum, and the FCC did look. If I could have more spectrum for licensed or unlicensed, yeah, definitely. But you have to make that decision looking at sharing and what is going on and what what innovations you're enabling, etc. So in a vacuum, yes. But when you have to make those trade-offs and you have to do that analysis and figure out how you're going to make it work, that's where the challenge is. And that, I think, is what we've seen, as Megan said, thousands and thousands of pages that led to that consideration. And hats off to the FCC for their work in making both licensed and licensed exempt spectrum available. Very, very challenging. And they do have to make these sort of trade-offs and do this analysis and come up with the rules. So hats off to the FCC for making both, but it isn't a bit in a vacuum. The answer is yes, I want more spectrum. How do you do it?
Well, I think that one of the things that, when I hear those numbers, it does make sense to me because while there have been a lot of simulations, there hasn't been a lot of real world testing. And so I think for the incumbents, I think what you're hearing is the voice of the incumbents, and the incumbents are concerned because while there was many simulations, at the end of the day, they are simulations. And there's nothing like actually getting out there, doing some empirical testing and seeing what the results of that are. And so I'm not surprised that the incumbents are very concerned because you saw the map that showed how many fixed links that are out there. But in addition to fixed links, there's all these mobile units that are out there used by like the National Association of Broadcasters. All those broadcasters are using it. And so there's a lot of concern out there from the incumbents. And while they, and certainly we also welcome Wi-Fi, the more we can use and get out of the bandwidth, the better, because it is a finite resource. But I think what you're seeing is concern for, we've got to be a little further down the road in terms of real empirical testing to get the comfort level where people will say, oh yes, this is truly a good thing for all of us.
Mark, it's Veena here. May I make a comment?
Yes, please.
Yeah, like others, I'm not surprised at the results, but we have to recognize that there is a concern out there to say, if the whole 1200 megahertz is made available for unlicensed, that really closes the doors for any mid-band requirement, capacity need for 5G beyond 3.3 to 3.8 and parts thereof, because that's not available everywhere. So there is a concern out there. So if you had asked a question that, folks agree with the lower part for unlicensed or a split, your response would have been different. But that's the thing. And the other thing is folks are not certain because there are two large markets. They are which have the potential to drive the ecosystem for all the equipment. We have United States for the whole 1200 megahertz, and they can drive, as you heard from Megan. They are certifying the devices, right? So that ecosystem can be driven. And then for more countries than what you have seen on the chart today, because folks are still thinking, many others. And then China coming from the other end and saying the entire 1200 megahertz for licensed. And they can also drive in the whole ecosystem for the licensed. And last but not least, let's not forget, whether it's licensed or unlicensed, this band, we have the opportunity because it's got the mobile allocation. So even if you don't make, it's a primary allocation, it's in the entire band. So even if you don't do any decision at the international level, you can use it for any application you want at a national level, as long as you can deal with your neighbors. So I think folks also have that in the back of their mind too, for licensed and unlicensed. But I think that there is a concern. If all of it goes to unlicensed, then the doors are shut for licensed because you can never get back to it. Thank you.
Yes, and that's kind of, I guess, where the question was trying to go, whether the kind of, let's say, the extreme decision of going one way or another is the right one. I think we have some arguments of why large carriers are needed. I guess the question is, could a kind of, would 800 megahertz have been enough as well? But maybe you kind of, you guys have some views on why, kind of a half-baked solution would be the wrong way to go here as well.
Mark, it's Alan. I found the question phenomenal that you posed, and it gets to the nub of the issue. Facebook is really agnostic to how people connect. We want the best experience for everybody and for consumers. And so we want to see a great 5G experience. We want to see a great Wi-Fi experience. We want to see a great ultra wideband. We want to see all these technologies flourish. We looked at this really carefully. So instead of taking it as a proprietary view as how a carrier would look at it, where any unlicensed spectrum is spectrum that's lost, or where just a little bit of spectrum for unlicensed is good enough or something, we looked at it and said, on balance, we need to find bands for 5G. We need to find bands for unlicensed. And we came out where 1.2 gigahertz made the right sense in this case for the 6 gigahertz band to make it unlicensed. So I realize there are a lot of trade-offs, but if you step back and from the consumer's perspective, it's important to have both be really successful. And I think the way you get it to be balanced is to find big chunks of spectrum for both, but not right next to each other like that. Thank you.
Well, so Mark, let me go since I've had a chance to hear everybody else, and I'd like to take a different tack on it. First of all, I'd say, the rulemaking is done and it is what it is. So while we appreciate that people are not fully happy with it, I guess the commission is like, well, deal. So I think that's what we're doing. Through the multi-stakeholder group, the commission said, look, and Megan said this, I think there were a lot of the rulemaking focused on the commission's review and critique review of the studies that were filed. And Tim makes a good point that there should be more measurements done. The commission's ruled, and it is what it is. So it's now up to the industry to make it work. And we're all part of that industry in some way, shape, or form. And for the most part, we're working on that. And, and I've been in the business a long time enough to know that, the commission is happy when they put out a rulemaking where they have this type of responsibility or this type of reaction, because it means that they don't have to get in the middle of it and sort it out. They've left it to industry. And so that's what I think we need to do. As industry, we did this with CBRS. We did it with TV Whitespace. The broadcasters screamed bloody murder with TV Whitespace. And did a lot of interesting things around that. And there has been some TV Whitespace deployment, probably not as much as we think we're going to get in the 6 gig band, but there haven't been many interference cases. Same thing with CBRS. The incumbents are, really concerned about interference. No interference cases with that. And so I think that, just judging from the way the multi-stakeholder group has come together, I think there's a lot of great, smart people that will figure this out and work on it. And at the end of the day, the AFCs will make it happen. And if there is interference, the multi-stakeholder group is supposed to deal with that. So don't go to the commission. On the other side of it, the point that Vina made regarding the amount of spectrum, and I think these are the two issues, whether there'll be interference and how much spectrum is made available. Again, that's another one where the decision has been made. I would just draw your attention to the point, because Tim referred to the map I put up and the potential for getting broad channels. When you think about this in terms of protecting incumbents, unlicensed users don't have the full 1200 megahertz available throughout the whole country. You might get it available in some of the white parts of the country, I should say the unused parts of the country where there's not a lot of microwave, but there's no guarantee in those areas that there's not other incumbents. So, the ability, I think we'll all benefit on the ability to have wideband channels that don't interfere. And one way of doing that is giving us a lot of wideband channels. So there will be other spectrum opportunities coming down the pipeline that I think the IMT folks can go after. Maybe spectrum right above this one, we don't know. But again, it is what it is, and we're all working to make it happen. And I'm sure that this time next year, we'll have another session, and it'll be successes and lessons learned from the 6 gig introduction.
To what extent can I ask, out of interest, to what extent can this actually be used very well for mobile for carriers in the sense of, I know that LTE unlicensed was something that was used in the US. Is there a case for NR unlicensed in the 6 gigahertz band, even if it's on a shared basis?
There is. 3GPP is looking at it. It's kind of out there a bit, but 3GP people are participating in the multi-stakeholder group and within the WIN forum. And that there is a pretty, and I think somebody said at the top of the session that when you think about the 5 gig band, there is a substantial amount of traditional carrier use of that band for NRU. Not NRU, but for unlicensed. And so we think that, and while that's lagging way behind Wi-Fi, there will be use cases to support NRU type operations in the band. In fact, somebody put a question in the chat about the offload potentials and onload. So, we absolutely see that in the work we're doing.
Is NR unlicensed that's on the GSMA's kind of radar, something that for mobile operators could be a way, kind of a way forward?
Well, let me say first that I don't think from GSMA perspective, any spectrum going to Wi-Fi is a lost spectrum. Absolutely not. Okay, we know the statistics, and you heard the statistics, and certainly there is very high importance of the unlicensed spectrum. So let's not, it's not underestimated. I think it's a question of what the opportunity is and planning long term, and where do we go? And right now, it's not easy to add another spectrum to the WRC agenda and say we can, use this mid-band later on. That's not in the cards right now. I can tell that to Mark very clearly, the other Mark. NRU, there has been use made in the 5 gigahertz, and how that happens in the 6 gigahertz remains to be seen. As Mark said, 3GPP is working on it, and we see it. But anything which is unlicensed, the problem is unless we do some of the sophistication, FCC has put in, because as you can see, the other jurisdictions they have done, they are all done very low power. So FCC has got this automatic frequency coordination. So unless you do very, sophisticated sharing techniques with the incumbents, the problem with the unlicensed is that you don't know where they are, and what the, if you get an interference to incumbents, there's a problem. If you have a licensed user in there with the incumbents, they can, first of all, do pre-coordination. And if there is even after that, if there is interference, you can at least deal with them. You can do proper enforcement and you can deal with that. And in 6 gigahertz band, the other important part is that many of the carriers are using probably, not probably, they are using for backhaul. It's a very, very good band for backhaul. And, US has taken the lead for doing this flexible use approach. And it gives the MNOs the opportunity to use it for mobile, use it for fixed wireless access, or use it for backhaul wherever they need it and what the situation is with the incumbents. So that's the story on 6 gig from a license perspective. But definitely, please do not think that Wi-Fi is underestimated in any form or shape. The role both MNOs and Wi-Fi has played in COVID right now is evident to all of us. So thank you.
Mark, this is Jane. If I could just add one other piece on this. So I think you'll see many of the companies here also talking about technology neutrality. So, I personally definitely expect to see NRU use of the band. I mean, where there is spectrum, we have seen in the past that operators and other technologies, as well as personal consumers, all enterprises, all utilizing the license exempt spectrum. And I fully expect to see that in the 6 gigahertz band as well. I fully expect it to carry a significant portion of the traffic as well. And as Veena said, the mobile operators already do have access to a large portion of the band for their backhaul. So I do expect, they are using it, and I think they'll use it in new use cases as well. So you will see a lot of different use cases. utilizing it and different technologies. So it is, when we, even though I was speaking of Wi-Fi earlier, it is tech neutral, and it is something that we advocate for, and I would expect NRU to be operating in the band as well going forward.
Perfect. I'm very conscious of time, so I will just mention that we had a second poll where the question was whether we expect other regions to follow the US example. I think there the overwhelming majority said yes, but in the way that not quite as much spectrum will be made available for unlicensed use. That's what I wanted to push this discussion a little more, and I think we had some very valuable contributions from all of you on that question of what are the pros and cons of making that spectrum available. I think it was a fascinating panel to have all of you on board. I think we got a great first view, and I actually I agree with Mark what you said. I'm pretty sure we'll have another panel on this in a year's time. I'd love to have you all back on that panel and just see whether we were right. But it sounds like lots happening in the 6 gigahertz band. There's sort of you can see where this could be going. I guess it's quite exciting for all of you to now kind of guide that along and see where we end up. So thanks very much to all of you. Thanks to the audience as well. There were a few questions which I'm afraid we didn't have the time to go into detail, but hopefully, kind of when the panel doesn't need questions to stimulate a discussion, it for me is always a great sign. So thanks very much again to all of you. All the panelists have seen your comments and contributions, and hopefully the audience found this panel as interesting as I did.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And I'd like to just echo Mark's thanks there to all of you guys on the panel. I think that was a fascinating discussion, and Mark, thank you to you as well for moderating it so expertly as well. So thank you. And one final thanks as well to Tom, not to forget Tom, who kicked things off this morning with an excellent presentation as well. So really good morning so far. So thank you all so much for that. And yeah, as I said, really do appreciate all of your time, and that was an excellent discussion there. So next, we are running just a little bit late, so we do have a short break now. So we're going to actually delay the start of the next session by 5 minutes. So we're going to start the next session at 11 o'clock Washington, D.C. time. So that's in 15 minutes time. So you do have 15 minutes to go and make yourself a cup of tea, cup of coffee, go and get some breakfast maybe. And we're starting back here then at 11 o'clock, where the next session is going to be looking at the CBRS band. So another key mid-band frequency, and looking forward to a discussion on that. So once again, thank you very much to all of our panelists, and to Mark for moderating that excellent session. Thank you to all of you out there for your questions and thoughts as well. As I said, 15 minutes break, and we'll be back here again for the CBRS session at 11 o'clock Washington time. Thanks, everyone.